Hey y'all, my name's Macy and I'm here today to answer some questions about mental health. But before I get into that, I just want to introduce myself a little bit. So, like I said, my name's Macy. I'm currently a sophomore and I'm currently working on my undergrad in psychology at the University of South Alabama. And my goal with that is to be able to get my bachelor's and then move on to graduate school where I'll hopefully get my PhD in counseling. So what we're doing today is I posted a Google form on my Instagram and Snapchat stories so that my followers, who are mostly young adults, can ask questions about mental health, and then I'm going to try to provide answers through some research, and all my sources will be cited on the webpage where this video is found. There were several questions. We're not going to have time to answer them all today, but hopefully I can hit the highlights and help out the people who had questions. So like I said, the target audience was young adults because that is what we're trying to do here at Mental Health for Young Adults. We're trying to provide resources and information specifically for young adults about mental health and mental health care, and also just trying to destigmatize mental health, not only for young adults, but for anybody with a mental health problem or who is seeking mental health care. The responses on my Google form that I posted are going to be completely anonymous, so I wanted people to really be able to feel like they could ask whatever was on their heart or on their mind without being worried about what I might think of them or risking some kind of confidentiality. So I have these questions categorized into several categories, and we're just going to go ahead and jump into the first, which is going to be mental health in the United States. Our first question is, how many people in the US have a mental disorder? So before I actually get into the statistics, let's kind of define mental disorder so we know what we're referring to throughout the rest of the video. So in psychology, we often define a mental disorder, or also called an abnormality, as characterized by one or more of the 4 Ds. So those are going to be deviant, distressing, dysfunctional, and or dangerous. So a mental disorder is going to cause deviance, distress, dysfunction, or danger in the life of the person that has it, at least one of those. Going by that definition of what a mental disorder is, or an abnormality, actually 1 in 3 people in the US could be diagnosed with a mental disorder and should seek psychological help. But unfortunately, of those 1 in 3, only 15% actually get the help they need for their disorder. A follow-up question I had about mental health in the US was, how does that compare to people in other countries? That answer is hard to say because it can be difficult to get your hands on statistics about mental health in other countries, and it's difficult to compare other countries to the United States because we don't know if they might define it differently than we do. But we do know that in the United States, there is a strong correlation between mental health disorders and discrimination or oppression. So it would be interesting to, with that in mind, look at other countries and see if they have more discrimination and oppression. Are they going to have higher cases of mental disorders? It's just more of something to think about and reflect on. But since that question is kind of general and it can be hard to compare other countries, that can be a difficult question to answer because, like I said, statistics are hard to find. They might not be measured the same way ours are, and that's very general. So, I mean, I thought about pulling up a couple of example countries just to see, but I decided to just leave it at that. The US is 1 in 3. Some countries are going to be way more, some countries are going to be way less, but there is a strong tie-in between discrimination and mental health problems. So our next section is mental health and religion and spirituality, and we had 2 really good questions on this topic, so I'm going to go ahead and share those. The first one was, is it healthy to constantly question religion / why you're here? So I would say it is totally healthy to question your religion or your spirituality or your lack thereof, as long as it's not becoming like we talked about earlier, one of the 4Ds, as long as it's not preoccupying you to the point of distress. Because in that case, that's more of an unhealthy obsession or maybe even an anxiety. There's nothing wrong with questioning your spirituality, especially if you grew up one way and you're kind of starting to discover your own ideas. But if it's to the point where it's a constant source of worry and anxiety for you, then that might be unhealthy. And our next question is there any correlation with suicide rates between those who profess to being believers of Christ and those who denounce any source of a higher power? And to answer that, I'm going to have to generalize a little bit because there's not really much research on strictly just Christians versus people who are agnostic or don't believe in any other sort of higher power. But I will say that this is kind of a complicated answer because it really depends on the individual. For example, a 2018 American Psychological Association study showed that around 62% of young adults with serious mental disorders brought up religion and spirituality in counseling on their own. It wasn't forced, there were no questions about it, they just brought it up. But when they did bring it up, their responses had a really wide range of attitude towards religion and spirituality. They were divided into 4 different categories, which included positive religion and spirituality coping, negative religion and spirituality coping, relationship with God, and implications for religion and spirituality and mental health. So what we get from that is it really just depends on the person. Some people find being a part of a religious or spiritual community to be very uplifting and very helpful, while some people find it to produce shame and guilt and other feelings that could actually contribute to the worsening of their mental disorder. So it really depends on the person and the situation, and different studies are going to tell you different things. So our first question about mental health for young adults is actually kind of 2 combined into 1. So the first question was, why is this generation's mental health razor thin? And the second one was, why does it feel like more and more people are being diagnosed with mental health issues? It seems like everyone is being diagnosed with anxiety, like myself recently, and depression when older generations didn't have as many cases, I feel like. So my answer to that is there are a number of factors that could contribute to this phenomenon of, in our eyes, our generation having more mental health issues than previous generations. Some studies are going to say that social media is to blame for our generation's increase in anxiety and depression, but then some studies will tell you that social media actually had no profound effect on our mental health. If anything, it might actually be helpful. Another option is that our generation really doesn't have more mental health problems than previous generations, but really we're just more likely to get help, more likely to be diagnosed, and more likely to talk about it. So it seems like we are worse off than the generations behind us, but in reality, we have just worked harder to destigmatize it, and we're more likely to discuss it, be open about it, and go get help for it. One last explanation to why everyone seems to be struggling lately could just be the circumstances that we're in here in the US, whether it be the spread of COVID-19 or election stress or racial or gender discrimination. I mean, there are several things going on in our country that could contribute to our generation's feelings of anxiety and depression. Our last question in this section is there a specific age range where signs of issues with mental health are more likely to show up? And once again, we're really going to have to generalize because different mental disorders have different ages of onset. But generally speaking, most mental health issues do manifest in young adulthood, which can be defined as from age 18 to 25. But of course, like I said, with different disorders, you're going to have different ages of onset. For example, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, that age of onset is often going to be later in life because it does come from a traumatic event, which the longer you live, the more opportunity you have to undergo something traumatic. Whereas disorders like ADD, attention deficit disorder, are going to manifest themselves at a younger age because we can see signs of them earlier like from a child not being able to focus or do well in school, for example. I named our next category mental health in daily life, but it also could probably just be called mental health in general because it kind of became a catch-all for the questions that I didn't know where to put. We'll start off with the first one, which says, when dealing with mental health issues, is it more important to consider genetics or environment? Or is it best to weigh both equally? Or does it depend on the mental health issue? So it does depend on the mental health issue. This is a phenomenon that psychologists often refer to as nature versus nurture. It does depend on the individual disorder, but even then, there are going to be different opinions on whether or not individual disorders are more affected by nature, being genetics, or nurture, being environment. But if you are interested in one specific disorder, a really good thing to research would be that disorder and twin studies. So twin studies can be super helpful in determining nature or nurture because what they will often do is study a pair of twins who are identical genetically but grew up in different environments, and they will see if they developed the same mental disorder or what the chances of them developing that disorder were. The next and last question in this section is, how do you tell the difference between an actual problem and being stressed or trying to get attention? So this is a good question, and I'm not sure if this person was referring to themselves or a friend or loved one, but the only way that you can find out for yourself if you're just stressed or if you actually have a disorder would be to go get help, to talk to someone, a licensed professional, and they're going to be able to help you through that. If you're concerned about someone else, the only person that can really help them is them. So while you can encourage them to seek help, and you should as a friend, you can't force them, and their reality is their reality. As a rule of thumb, never assume that anyone who is confiding in you about their mental health is attention seeking, because that can be a really negative narrative to create for someone who is struggling and who opens up and chooses to confide in you, as well as you would rather err on the side of caution. It's always better to be safe than sorry. So if someone is choosing to confide in you, never assume they're attention seeking, and always just be an open ear, be a good listener. Now, although I said the only person that can help them is them, that is usually the case. However, if you have a friend or loved one who you feel is in danger of harming themselves or someone else, you have every right to go get help, to tell someone, even if they ask you not to, because their safety and the safety of others is always going to be a priority. Now that we've talked about mental health in general and several different categories, we're going to move on to some specific mental disorders or abnormalities. So the first one that I got a question about was eating disorders, more specifically anorexia. So the question was, is anorexia a mental disorder? And the answer is yes. The technical term is anorexia nervosa, and it usually involves co-occurring mental and physical health symptoms. So, of course, if you are purposely dramatically restricting your calories, you are going to have physical symptoms because your body is not going to be healthy from that lifestyle. But at the same time, anorexia is a result of a mental problem. But even though it is technically a disorder, if you have been diagnosed with anorexia, don't think that something is wrong with you. It's actually very common in the United States and other Western cultures where traditionally thin bodies are so idealized. So if you do have anorexia or think you might have it but you haven't been diagnosed, I would encourage you to talk to a professional and see if you can get help. I also got one question about anxiety, and the question was, can panic attacks be silent, like you're having one but you can hide it? So the answer to this is actually yes. A lot of times I know we think of panic attacks as like a big production and like everybody's gonna see and notice, but actually panic attacks are characterized by several symptoms, and you only have to have 4 of those symptoms for your panic attack to be legitimate. So those symptoms include heart palpitations, tingling, shortness of breath, sweating, hot or cold flashes, trembling, chest pain, choking sensation, faintness, dizziness, or feelings of unreality. So if you're displaying 4 of those symptoms that may not be visible to just the naked eye, you could totally be having a panic attack and be silent or be hiding it. But if you are suffering from a panic attack or symptoms of a panic attack, you are always encouraged to ask someone for help, even if it's not a professional. Notify someone if you're feeling that way, so you don't have to suffer silently and you don't have to talk yourself through it. Someone can help you. Our last category of all was another specific mental disorder, which is depression. And there were several questions about this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first. The first question is, what do I say to someone who has depression or another mental health disorder? So, first of all, if someone has chosen to confide in you about their mental health, the first thing to do is thank them for being open and thank them for being vulnerable, because that is not easy to do in a culture where mental health, specifically depression, can be very stigmatized. If this is a loved one of yours, you're gonna know best what to say to them, but it is important that you let them know that you will try to be as understanding as possible. You're always going to be there for them, and you're going to be a listening ear. Our next question is actually 2 questions, but I kind of rolled the answer into one. So the questions are, how do you help someone with depression that doesn't want help? And the second question is it bad to pressure someone with depression into talking to you about it? So for any mental health disorder, you really don't want to force anyone to disclose information that they aren't ready to share. I know that can be hard because you care about your loved one, but the best thing to do is just to let them know that you are there for them, you notice something's wrong, and whenever they're ready to talk, you'll be there to listen. Now, the only exception to this rule is if your loved one is showing signs that they might hurt themselves or another person. In that case, it is more than appropriate to let someone else know what is going on. The next depression-related question is, can people be sad for no reason? So whether you're talking about sadness, which is just an emotion and not a disorder, or depression, these things, sadness or depression, rarely happen for no reason. Even if you feel like you're sad for no reason because there may not have been an external stimulus that brought on these emotions, something is happening in your brain that's making you upset, some kind of imbalance. What's important is that you recognize the difference between just feeling down and being depressed. So if your sadness is becoming, like we've talked about, one of the 4 Ds, distressing, dangerous, deviant, dysfunctional, it might be time to consider that something bigger is wrong. Our next question is depression really overdiagnosed? I've been told this by my parents as they seem to downplay my diagnosis. Is it true? So, short answer to this question is no. There is a specific set of diagnostic criteria that any licensed professional is going to follow out of a book called the DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. And if you meet enough of those criteria to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have it. It's not overdiagnosed as long as you are going to a professional. If you're going to someone who knows what they're doing, you're not going to be overdiagnosed. This seems to me like a good time to bring up a term that is called gaslighting, which is basically making a victim question their own reality, or making a victim feel like something is their fault. So we can be gaslighted by our parents. It sounds like they are trying to downplay your diagnosis. They're trying to make you question your reality. And your reality is your reality. You know the truth, and you know that you're not okay. So while it might be hard living with or being in constant communication with parents who think your diagnosis is not true or they're trying to downplay it, you know what is true for you and what your reality is. Our next question regarding depression is, do depression and bipolar disorders go together? So not necessarily. The thing is, if you have MDD, major depressive disorder, that does not include symptoms of bipolar. But if you're diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which there are actually 2 types, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, but if you're diagnosed with either, the symptoms of both of those do include depressive episodes, because bipolar is when you fluctuate from a depressive state to a manic state. It's kind of like the all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares kind of thing. So if you are diagnosed with depression, that does not go hand in hand with bipolar. But if you're diagnosed with bipolar, you will show symptoms of depression when you're fluctuating between depression and mania. All right, this is our final question, not only of this section, but of the whole video, and it is, does depression cause memory loss? So while major depressive disorder doesn't directly cause memory loss, there are symptoms of depression that could make you forgetful. For example, one major symptom of depression is either insomnia or hypersomnia. Well, if you're not getting enough sleep, it might be hard to focus and it might be hard to learn. Or if you're sleeping through a class or through a conversation, you're obviously not going to remember it. So, though depression doesn't directly cause memory loss, its symptoms could cause you to be forgetful. If you are feeling forgetful and you're wondering if it might be a side effect of depression, I would go back and think, what is really making me lose this memory? Is it direct memory loss, or am I not remembering things because I'm too tired to focus, or my mind is on something else, or it's because I can't sleep or I'm sleeping too much? Something like that. And with that, we are done with all the questions. I did not get to answer all the questions that were sent in, but I tried to hit the highlights and answer some of the ones that I felt I could best answer through research and through the sources that I found. Thanks so much for watching, and if you sent in a question, thank you so much for being open and being vulnerable and sharing your questions with me. I hope I could help. Thank y'all.